Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Greco from EBSCO, and I'm very excited for today's Harvard Business Review Press Author Spotlight. Richard Schmlanesee is a world-famous economist and business educator whose research has centered on industrial organization economics and its application to managerial and public policy issues. He has particular expertise in the economics of energy and of multi-sided platforms. He is the Howard W. Johnson Professor of Management and Economics Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Schmlanesee is the author of co-author of 11 books and more than 120 published articles, and he is the co-editor of volumes 1 and 2 of the Handbook of Industrial Organization, a standard reference. His co-authored book, Markets for Power, gave major impetus to the global restructuring of the electric utility industry, and his books with David Evans on 2 multi-sided platforms, payment systems, and software platforms have become standard references. Professor Schmlanesee is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has served on the editorial boards of 6 academic journals, was elected to the Executive Committee of the American Economic Association, and was the 2012 Distinguished Fellow of the Industrial Organization Society. Today, Richard will be presenting on his latest co-authored book, Matchmakers, The New Economics of Multi-Sided Platforms. Now, without further ado, Richard Schmlanesee.
Thank you, Jessica, for that generous introduction. And greetings, everyone. I want to talk today about multi-sided platforms, or as David Evans and I called them in our recently published book, Matchmakers. This slide, this first section, makes the point that we are surrounded by matchmakers. On this slide, you see the names of a number of visible, large, successful companies, and some old, some new, and what they all have in common is that they're matchmakers. What a matchmaker does is it operates a platform, a virtual or physical platform, that makes it easy and efficient for people and businesses in 2 separate groups, normally 2 different groups, to connect. So the first example there is the shopping mall, which is a device to bring shoppers and merchants together. Uber is obviously a platform, virtual in this case, not physical, to bring drivers and riders together. The App Store brings app developers and consumers together, and Visa has for many years made it easier for merchants and consumers to do business. If you listen to the things said about today's economy, the gig economy, the app economy, the sharing economy, all of those are descriptions of different sorts of matchmakers. And if you go through your daily life, anyone's daily life, this young woman's daily life, everything she does almost involves a matchmaker. She wakes up to an alarm on her iPhone, takes an Uber to work, uses Windows, uses LinkedIn, does some online shopping while she's supposed to be working, checks her stocks, makes a date, gets a restaurant reservation, pays for the cab home with a credit card. She's used matchmakers all day long. And most of these involve technology. But it's important to understand that the matchmaker business model isn't fundamentally about technology. One of the oldest examples, putting aside village matchmakers, that we've found is the Emporion, which was an Athenian gathering place for merchants and ship captains and financiers who would get together to plan, finance, and stock a trading voyage. The London Stock Exchange, again, brings people together to buy, sell, and hold stock. It would have been harder to connect without that innovation. MasterCard, Visa, 50 years old, Microsoft, 30 years old. This is not new stuff, not a new model. What is new is the technology. Advances in computation and communications have essentially made it easier for people and businesses to connect to each other. That makes it easier as a technical matter to build businesses based on connecting. And in fact, if you look at the most visible matchmakers, the scale they've attained is really quite remarkable. 1 trillion Google searches a year, 1 billion Facebook users a day. These are huge numbers. So let's ask ourselves, what exactly is the business model here? How do these things work? It's not all gathering on the dock in Athens to arrange voyages. What are the fundamentals? Well, the fundamentals are there is a pot of gold if you can solve a very hard business problem. Matchmakers are different from ordinary businesses. Because they exist to connect, what they're really supplying is access, easy connection, not stuff, or not even services as we normally think of them. They're fighting frictions that make it hard for people to get together. Uber fights friction that makes it hard for riders and drivers to connect. In order to make a go of it, any matchmaker business needs a critical mass on both sides or all sides of the business. It's like a singles bar. Very physically attractive bar, but if there are no women, men don't come, and if there are no men, women don't come. If there are a lot of both, everybody comes. That's the key problem. Can you get to critical mass? Part of getting to critical mass is often subsidizing, providing something for free, maybe even offering rewards. Google doesn't charge me to search. Newspapers charge me to read the paper. Google doesn't charge me. And often, matchmakers make rules and enforce them, and the usual typical enforcement is banishment. So matchmakers often don't charge some of their customers, and they often, in fact, exclude some customers. They make money by taking a piece of the value of the matches they create. Let's look at an example, one of my favorites, OpenTable. OpenTable dealt with the friction of making a reservation in the case of the founder in San Francisco on a busy Saturday night, making reservation by telephone. They don't answer. They don't have a table. You can take hours. Now it's easy. You simply dial them up on your mobile phone or computer, and you see who's got a table for as many people as you want when you want it nearby. But hard time getting going. They launched in the dot-com era, and of course the first thought anybody had was get a bunch of eyeballs. So the CEO, who had connections with restaurant chains, signed up restaurants all around the country. They had thousands of restaurants, but they couldn't attract diners. Because what do I care? I live in Boston, and what do I care how many restaurants are online in Kansas City, Missouri? I'm not going there. I want to know not how many restaurants they have, but how many restaurants that I might patronize. And similarly, the restaurants in Massachusetts don't actually care if you've got consumers in Colorado. They want to know who's nearby. What saved them, and they had patient investors, which is why they survived and a lot of other online reservation operations launched at about the same time failed. They focused. They said, let's forget the country. Let's focus on San Francisco. Let's high-end name restaurants, let's provide them with table management software so that they'll sign on with us even if they don't get a lot of online reservations. And then when we have restaurants signed up, we can go get consumers. And we're going to get consumers by making it free. In fact, they offer rewards for frequent dining. So it's a negative price to consumers and a positive price for restaurants. Once they conquered San Francisco, they went to Chicago, and they gradually rolled out through the U.S. and abroad. What they found, what so many other matchmakers have found, is you have to get enough folks, businesses or consumers, on both sides or all sides if it's more than two, to make the business attractive. Once they had a lot of restaurants and once they had a lot of diners, the pitch to the next set of diners and restaurants was easy. Until they got enough, it was very hard. They had to have a strategy to get to the critical mass frontier. What happens to most businesses of this sort is they don't make it, they don't get enough participants, they run out of money, and they die. An interesting example were business-to-business exchanges. Around the year 2000, everyone thought they would take over the universe. Billions, trillions of transactions were going to be done in business-to-business exchanges online in a few years. Well, they weren't. Why? Well, it wasn't that hard in the U.S. for businesses to find suppliers, and it wasn't really that hard for suppliers to locate potential customers, and doing a transaction with a good legal system, good communications, good transportation, not that hard. So the business-to-business exchanges in the U.S. weren't solving a major friction. Moreover, when suppliers signed on, it was easier for buyers to compare prices. So for suppliers, not only wasn't it positively attractive, it was negatively attractive. It increased price competition. Almost all of these exchanges died. Even Apple has had a hard time launching a business of this kind. Apple launched Apple Pay in 2014 with great fanfare. There's Tim Cook. There's a demo that says how hard it is to pay with a credit card and how easy it is to pay by tapping your phone. So, did Apple ignite? Did it solve the critical mass problem? Not yet. It's a tiny fraction of all card transactions. Why? Well, not that many people had iPhone 6s, which is what you needed to set up Apple Pay. And if you set up Apple Pay, as I did and others with iPhone 6s, you found that most merchants didn't have the special kind of contactless terminals you needed to use Apple Pay. But merchants had no real incentive to get those terminals because so few people had iPhone 6s with Apple Pay. So it was classic. You didn't have enough merchants and you didn't have enough consumers. Now, Apple may make this thing work. Merchants are installing new terminals, for other reasons, and Apple has deep pockets. But the initial approach for several years was a failure. On the other hand, some people do manage to do it. Some businesses have been disrupted. Taxis, newspaper ads, malls, SMS text messaging have all been hammered by turbocharged, technology-charged matchmakers. Let's now ask ourselves, what do you look for opportunities and risks? When is this sort of business model likely to go, and when is it not likely to go? What do you look for? Well, as I mentioned, the first thing you look for is it solving a problem? Is it a big deal? So if you look in the lower right-hand quadrant here, new payment networks, and there have been dozens of them, launched with great fanfare, certainly since the 90s, that have failed because credit cards work pretty well. And it's really hard to get to scale in that business. They don't deal with much of a friction. It is very hard to get to critical mass. They've failed. Facebook is that rare example of a matchmaker that apparently creates great value for its users. I'm not particularly one of them, and was easy to ignite, starting with college populations and gradually growing and then bringing in advertising and so forth. Google and Android, great value, hard to ignite, they ignited. Ad-supported websites, easy to start up, don't solve much of a friction, and really don't tend to create much value. So you look for the size of the friction and the ignition. Now, to come back to the business-to-business example, things were different in China when China started to modernize, let's say in the late 90s. It wasn't easy for buyers and sellers, businesses, to get together. Communications was terrible. Transportation was awful. The legal system, the commerce system, not well developed, hard to do business at a distance. Alibaba set up a business-to-business marketplace that, unlike the U.S., solved massive frictions, provided a viable solution, and took off. Alibaba has gone into other lines, but the first line was to make it possible for small businesses in particular to buy and sell effectively. Now, as matchmakers begin to take off, they tend to, uh, particularly in the developed world, attack, so to speak, earlier matchmakers, right? Taxi companies also bring drivers and riders together. Uber does it differently. Um, Ad-supported media bring advertisers and eyeballs together. Google does it better. Amazon Marketplace buyers and sellers together in a way that shopping malls really can't match. But a key thing to keep in mind is that the technology doesn't stop and innovation doesn't stop. So the story's not over. I don't know whether Amazon Alexa will take over from Google search, or that blockchain will take over from the various dark pools and stock exchanges and online exchanges. But there is constant innovation going on in technology and business models. And there are constant investment opportunities made available to investors. We think you go a long way toward saving your money when confronted with something that looks like a matchmaker that is going to revolutionize the world and become the Uber of something, to just walk through these questions. What's the problem it solves? Matchmakers solve frictions that inhibit interactions, that inhibit productive, value-creating interactions. How big is the friction? Big in China, business to business, small in the U.S., business to business. How big's the friction? What is it? Who benefits from solving it? Second, what's your solution? All right, OpenTable was not the only online restaurant reservation system when it launched. It just happened to be better than the others, and it happened to get the model right. So the first question, what's the problem? And the second is, why is your solution better than others? You also want to ask, do you have something proprietary that'll keep it better than others? Third is, how do you get to critical mass? How hard is the ignition problem? How do you get there? And fourth, and this really in part is part of three, is do you have the prices right? Are you making it attractive to all groups to get on board your platform? You know, if Matchmaker had decided to charge consumers a dime for every restaurant reservation, I strongly doubt that it would have made it, since at the margin phone calls are free. Finally, and this has as much to do with management as with a business model, particularly innovative matchmakers are going to get it wrong in a way that OpenTable got it wrong. They're going to have to modify almost always in response to new information. Can they do it? Can they do it? So I want to leave you, having talked about gloom and doom and how hard it is to start a matchmaker, with a success story that I personally find quite inspiring, and that's what happened in Kenya. Circa 2007, Kenya had a lot of men typically working in cities wanting to send cash to families back in the village. That was hard. You give it to a bus driver, you give it to a cabbie, the roads are terrible, there's a lot of theft, there's a lot of pretend theft. Very tough thing to do. So the dominant phone carrier thinks hard about this problem. Notices that a lot of people have feature phones, no smartphones. There are a lot of convenience stores around the country, in and around little villages. Not a lot of banks, not a lot of banks. They develop a system called M-Pesa. Pesa is Swahili for money. M-Pesa. And by 2013, 74% of the adult population used it. Initially, as in that, the picture in the middle here is an award-winning TV ad that shows the money flying from the city to this happy woman in the village. 74% of the population used M-Pesa to send money. But of course, once you've got this platform set up, it can be, you can develop it into a bill payment mechanism, into a savings mechanism, link it to a bank. This transformed life in Kenya in important ways. Not driven by high tech, but driven by very thoughtful use of available technology and a very, very clever launch strategy, as well as the cooperation of the local government. So I hope I've whetted your appetite to learn a little more about multi-sided platforms. I think this is a fascinating and important and increasingly important topic, and I thank you for your attention.